When Kabul fell, the world watched the fighters. No one looked at the women behind them. They weren't just wives, they were prisoners inside their own homes, hidden behind walls, behind veils, behind silence. Some were killed, some vanished without a trace, and one survived long enough to tell the truth, a truth so disturbing the Taliban tried to erase it. But her voice slipped through the cracks, a whisper that became impossible to silence. This is that story, the unseen, untold final hours of the women who lived and died in the shadows of the Taliban. When the Taliban seized Kabul in 1996, the world was already weary of war. Afghanistan, after years of brutal civil conflict, was left fractured. The Taliban, claiming to be the bearers of peace, promised stability after the chaos of the Mujahideen's reign. But what came wasn't peace, it was control, absolute and suffocating. From the moment they took power, the Taliban imposed a strict interpretation of Sharia law. Public life in Kabul and across Afghanistan transformed overnight. Women, once seen in the streets, now disappeared behind doors. Schools closed. Jobs were no longer an option. A woman's life was confined to her home, her voice muted. As the Taliban tightened their grip, their vision of society became clear. Women were to be invisible. They could no longer walk freely in the streets, laugh in public, or even be seen without a male guardian by their side. Women who dared defy these rules faced severe punishment. The chadri, the full-body veil, became mandatory. If you didn't have one, you risked being whipped in public, sometimes for something as small as a flash of ankle. No woman was safe. But what many didn't see was the dark truth behind the leaders themselves, the wives, the women married to the very men who led through terror and fear. These wives were forced into isolation, trapped within the walls of their own homes. They couldn't speak to outsiders, and they couldn't leave. Their existence, like that of every woman in the country, became defined by an unspoken law of silence and obedience. What does it mean to live in a world where your very existence is controlled by someone else's beliefs? Where your own body is treated as a symbol of oppression, a tool to enforce power? These women lived that reality, hiding their humanity behind closed doors, waiting for something, a flicker of freedom, a breath of air. But freedom was never coming. It was only a matter of time before their suffering would reach its breaking point. And for some, that breaking point came in the shadows, in moments no one would ever know. What happened to them inside these homes, to the wives of the Taliban's most feared leaders? Some perished in silence. Some were killed without a trace. Some, though, lived long enough to tell their story. But their stories were almost lost to time, buried beneath the silence that defined their lives, until one voice broke through. One woman's story would come to light, shattering the wall of secrecy. This is where it begins. For the wives of the Taliban's leaders, life was a prison behind painted windows and locked doors. Their husbands, the men who led through terror and fear, kept them hidden from the world. The women's lives were dictated by the same rules that governed the rest of Afghanistan, rules that stripped them of their identity, their rights, and their freedom. Inside their homes, a quiet terror reigned. Every aspect of their existence was controlled. They couldn't speak freely, laugh without restraint, or even share a moment of joy. The rooms were silent, not out of respect or peace, but out of fear. Fear that even the smallest sound could draw attention from the outside world, or the religious police that patrolled the streets with whips in hand. Women in Afghanistan were meant to be seen by no one, heard by no one. When a woman became the wife of a Taliban leader, her life changed in ways most could never imagine. It wasn't about luxury or status, it was about submission. The wives were forced to wear the same full-body veil that every other woman had to wear,
covering every inch of skin except for their eyes. The chaudhry became a symbol of their captivity, a constant reminder of their role in a society that considered them little more than shadows. They lived in houses with no windows that could be opened, no lights that could shine out. Their world was as dark as the rooms they were confined to. While their husbands ruled with violence, the wives were also part of a system that enforced the very oppression that trapped them. They were not allowed to speak to neighbors, to servants, or even to family members without their husband's permission. Even the smallest act of rebellion was punished severely. Many wives lived in constant silence, unable to even express a thought without risking severe consequences. The Taliban's rule over women went beyond just their outward appearance. The oppression was psychological. No woman in Afghanistan could exist without the constant weight of fear on her shoulders. Every woman knew that any small mistake could lead to violence. There were stories of women who dared to speak out of turn, who laughed too loudly, or who walked alone without a male guardian. They were punished in the most brutal ways, whipped, beaten, or publicly humiliated. But what was it like for the wives of the Taliban's leaders? They too were victims of this brutal system, forced into lives of secrecy and confinement. They lived in fear, not only of their husbands, but also of the society they were bound to. They were trapped between two worlds, their husbands who demanded their loyalty and silence, and a society that saw them as invisible, as nothing more than a symbol of the oppression they had to endure. For these women, there was no escape. Even the smallest moments of rebellion were dangerous. Even the thought of freedom was an illusion. They were forced to live behind the walls of their own homes, locked away from the world, from other women, from any chance of breaking free. But even in their isolation, some found ways to resist. Some found a way to break the silence, to make their voices heard just for a brief moment. What they would reveal would go on to shake the world. Under the Taliban's rule, there were no safe spaces for women. Their every move was scrutinized, every breath monitored. The consequences for defying the rigid rules were swift and brutal. Public punishment became a tool of control, and for many women, it was not just a matter of fear, it was a daily reality. One of the most horrific practices of the Taliban regime was the religious policing carried out by the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Their job was simple: to ensure that every woman, no matter her status, followed the strict guidelines of the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law. And if a woman dared break any of the rules, punishment was swift and violent. Women caught in public without the proper full-body veil, the chaudhry, were dragged through the streets, whipped mercilessly. Some were beaten in full view of others, the lashes striking their skin as a reminder to everyone of the price of disobedience. Even something as small as showing an ankle or laughing in public could lead to beatings, often administered by the religious police in front of a crowd, forcing women to endure not just the physical pain, but the public humiliation. Perhaps one of the most disturbing abuses was the punishment of women who tried to seek medical care. For a mother with a sick child, without a male guardian to accompany her, the choice was a cruel one. She could either risk the wrath of the religious police and venture outside alone, hoping to find a doctor, or let her child suffer in silence, trapped within the four walls of their home. Some women, desperate to help their children, dared to go out alone and paid with their lives. There were reports of women being stopped on their way to hospitals, violently interrogated, and in some cases, even shot. One tragic account described a woman carrying her feverish child, shot at close range by a Taliban guard while trying to reach a doctor. The child barely survived, and both mother and child were hidden by neighbors who risked their own lives to keep them safe. The risks of seeking medical attention went beyond just the threat of violence. It was a matter of survival. With no access to education, no ability to seek employment, and little help from outside, women were left to endure medical crises alone. Many women died during childbirth, as medical care was simply out of reach. Hospitals that were once run by female doctors were closed, and male doctors were often unavailable or untrained to handle women's health issues. The result was devastating. Unnecessary deaths from complications that could have been avoided had women been allowed to live freely, to seek help, and to have proper care. But even in the face of such oppression, some women managed to find ways to fight back, even if it was just for a moment. The Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan risked everything to document the horrors of the Taliban. They smuggled footage of public executions, beatings, and floggings to the outside world, providing the first visual evidence of Taliban brutality that would eventually shock the world. Despite the Taliban's efforts to erase their existence, these women, even in the most dire of circumstances, found ways to resist, even in silence. They risked their lives to speak the truth, to show the world what was really happening behind closed doors. The world would soon know their suffering, but at a cost. For many, that cost would be their lives. For the wives of the Taliban's most powerful leaders, their existence was defined by an invisible, suffocating cage. While the world outside was in constant turmoil, these women were shut away, isolated from the people they once knew, cut off from any form of social life or even basic freedoms. They lived in what could only be described as luxury prisons. Homes that were heavily guarded, their windows painted over, covered by sheets, or sealed shut to prevent any glimpse of life beyond their walls.
The walls that separated them from the outside world were not just physical. They were psychological, too. These women were not allowed to speak to anyone outside their immediate family, not to servants, neighbors, or anyone who might give them a chance to speak freely. The strict rules governing their lives were enforced by their husbands, men who ruled with violence, and by the unseen forces of the Taliban's religious police. These women were part of a larger system of control, but they were also victims within that system, forced to endure and silence. Inside these walls, the wives of the Taliban lived under constant surveillance. Their husbands were the face of oppression, but their wives were the silent enforcers of the very system that locked them in. They too were trapped. They lived lives of constant restriction, no jewelry, no music, no photos, no laughter. They were not allowed to express happiness, joy, or freedom in any form. Everything about their existence was designed to erase their identity, to make them mere shadows in a world dominated by men. Even the smallest freedoms that these women might have once enjoyed, simple things like walking in the garden or speaking to a neighbor, were now forbidden. These women were isolated not only from the world, but from each other. Their homes were their only reality, and the four walls that confined them became their entire world. Their sense of self was stripped away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but their roles as wives of Taliban commanders. Some of these women never left their homes for years, knowing the consequences if they did. They lived in complete darkness, physically and emotionally. The psychological toll of this isolation was unimaginable. The very act of seeing another woman, sharing a conversation, or experiencing joy was forbidden. The world outside remained distant, a place they could only dream of but never touch. They were never allowed to have a voice. It wasn't just a life of silence, it was a life of fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of being heard, fear of being punished. If these women ever dared to act out of line or show any form of disobedience, they knew what awaited them: punishment. The religious police were relentless, watching every move, waiting for the slightest infraction. The women lived knowing that any mistake could cost them everything: safety, freedom, and sometimes their lives. But even in this total confinement, some of these women found ways to rebel in silence. In whispers and through secret actions, some pushed back against the system that had locked them away. And their stories, though few and far between, would later emerge, hidden beneath the layers of oppression. These women, forgotten by most of the world, would soon reveal the true cost of the Taliban's reign. While the wives of the Taliban leaders lived in isolation, unable to break free from their confined existence, a group of women outside the walls of power took a dangerous stand to expose the Taliban's brutality to the world, becoming a voice for the voiceless women trapped within the regime's iron grip. RAWA was born out of defiance. Founded in the mid-1970s, the organization had long fought for women's rights and social justice, but under Taliban rule, their mission took on an even greater urgency. Operating from secret locations within Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan, they carried out their work under constant threat of death. They understood that exposing the truth about the Taliban's treatment of women, even in the smallest way, could lead to brutal retribution. But they did it anyway. One of RAWA's most daring missions was to smuggle footage out of Kabul, footage that captured the public executions, the floggings, the beatings, and the terror that was part of daily life under the Taliban rule. Cameras were hidden in homes, in pockets, and behind false walls. The women of RAWA knew that even being caught with a camera could mean death, but they risked it, determined to show the world the suffering of women they could not speak for. The footage they smuggled out to Pakistan told a shocking story. Public executions in stadiums became a grim spectacle under the Taliban, with women condemned to die for alleged immorality or adultery, often without any trial or evidence. Women who violated the strict codes of conduct were humiliated, publicly beaten or whipped, and stoned to death in front of crowds. These were not isolated incidents. They were the terrifying realities of life for women under the Taliban, where a simple misstep could cost a woman everything. RAWA's mission was not only to document the violence, but to expose the truth to the outside world. They used underground newspapers, leaflets, and later websites to distribute the footage and accounts. It was a slow, dangerous process, but the small pieces of evidence they provided painted a clear picture. The Taliban system was not one of peace and security, but one of terror and control. Through their bravery, they made sure the world saw what was happening in Afghanistan, even if the world didn't want to see it. But as RAWA continued its work, the danger only increased. Women caught trying to smuggle footage or information were often caught, tortured, and executed. The Taliban's Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice was relentless, hunting down any woman who dared to challenge their authority. And yet, even as the regime became more brutal, RAWA continued its mission in secrecy, documenting the horrors and sending them to the outside world. While the wives of the Taliban's leaders may have been trapped within their own homes, their stories were slowly being uncovered by women like those in RAWA. These brave women risked everything to expose the suffering of those behind the walls, knowing the weight of their actions could bring both freedom and death. They were the hidden fighters, the ones who fought not with weapons, but with the truth.
And for some, their sacrifices would bear fruit. The world would eventually see the Taliban for what it truly was. But for the women of RAWA, that truth would come at a cost that many would never survive to see. When the Taliban regime fell in 2001, it was a moment of triumph for many who had suffered under their brutal rule. The U.S.-led coalition forces quickly took control of Kabul, and the Taliban fighters, who had once seemed invincible, fled into the mountains and across the border into Pakistan. The world cheered as the brutal regime was toppled, but for the women who had been trapped within it, the end of the Taliban rule did not immediately mean freedom. For the wives of Taliban leaders, their lives became a new kind of uncertainty. The system they had lived under had collapsed, but the scars of years of abuse and oppression ran deep. These women who had lived under the control of men who ruled with violence were now left in limbo. Their husbands had disappeared into the mountains, sought refuge in neighboring countries, or were captured. Their homes, once secure under Taliban rule, were now vulnerable to raids by opposing forces. In some cases, entire families were forced to flee, escaping the wrath of the new government that sought retribution for the violence committed under the Taliban. But even in the face of collapse, the women did not find peace. Some were left behind in Afghanistan, their families scattered, their futures uncertain.
As the Taliban disbanded and moved into exile, the wives were often the ones left to deal with the aftermath. The chaos of war, the violence of the insurgency, and the lack of stability left them in a state of constant fear and confusion. The women were forced into hiding, often moving from one safe house to the next, never knowing when the next raid would come or when they might be found. The Taliban leadership fled to the tribal areas of Pakistan, including cities like Quetta and Peshawar, where they were sheltered by sympathetic groups. The wives of these leaders followed, often in the dark of night, hoping to avoid detection. They lived in cramped, overcrowded safe houses, unable to go outside, rarely allowed to speak to anyone but their immediate family members. Life in exile was a life of constant movement, fear, and isolation. Their every moment was dictated by the shifting allegiances and secret operations of their husbands, who moved from one location to another, always under the threat of being targeted by airstrikes or intelligence operations. For many of these women, the worst was not over. While the men of the Taliban were hunted by foreign forces, the women were left to fend for themselves, often with little to no support. They were isolated not just by the walls of their homes, but by the constant threat of violence and the shame of their association with a regime that had caused so much suffering. But even in exile, there was no escape. The Taliban fighters were not the only ones who feared for their lives. These women feared for their survival too. They were caught in the middle of an ongoing war, now in hiding, no longer wives of leaders, but still living with the consequences of their past. They were forced to witness the ongoing cycle of violence, with no idea if their husbands would return or if they would ever truly be safe again. By 2009, the world's focus had shifted from Afghanistan to the dangerous, rugged regions of Pakistan, where Taliban leaders like Baitullah Masood were hiding. Masood, one of the most feared Taliban commanders, had become notorious for his bombings, suicide attacks, and ruthless control over the tribal areas. He was the face of terror in the region, responsible for numerous attacks on civilian and military targets alike. It was the face of terror in the region, responsible for numerous attacks on civilian and military targets alike. It was the face of terror in the region, responsible for numerous attacks on civilian and military targets alike. To eliminate the threat posed by figures like Masood, the U.S. and Pakistani military turned to drone strikes, the weapon of choice in the war on terror. These unmanned aerial vehicles, controlled from thousands of miles away, became the primary tool used to target Taliban commanders hiding in the mountains and rural areas. It was an efficient but deadly method of warfare. In August 2009, intelligence sources reported that Masood, weakened by an illness, was hiding in the small village of Zangra in South Waziristan. It was believed that his wife was there attending to him as he battled kidney problems and other health issues. On the night of August 5th, U.S. drones hovered silently above the village, waiting for confirmation that Masood was inside the compound. Once it was clear that he was there, 2 Hellfire missiles were fired. The first explosion tore through the compound, sending debris flying. The second strike ensured complete destruction. The roof collapsed, and within moments, the building was buried under rubble. Masood was killed instantly, unable to escape. But his wife, who had been caring for him, was not as fortunate. She was buried alive in the wreckage, crushed by the weight of the building that once sheltered her.
Her name was never released to the public. In the records of the attack, she remained an unnamed casualty, a statistic in a war that had already claimed countless lives. But even though she was reduced to a shadow, her death carried a deep symbolic weight. She was the first confirmed wife of a Taliban leader to be killed in a drone strike, a sign of the brutal collateral damage of modern warfare. For the United States, the killing of Baitullah Masood was hailed as a victory. Masood had masterminded countless deadly attacks, and his death was a major blow to the Taliban's operations. Yet the loss of his wife, a woman who had lived in isolation for years, trapped in a system of terror and fear, was largely ignored. Her life, her suffering,
and her tragic end were buried beneath the headlines that celebrated the success of the strike. This wasn't just another casualty of war. It was the tragic reality of the lives of women married to powerful Taliban commanders. These women were never seen as individuals, only as extensions of their husbands. Their identities were erased, their suffering ignored, and their deaths were often nothing more than collateral damage. As drone strikes continued, the lives of these women would remain in the shadows, their stories untold. But for the Taliban, the death of Masood's wife was not just a personal loss, it was a warning. The strike, though successful in eliminating one of their most feared commanders, also showed the vulnerabilities of the Taliban's families. These women, who had lived in complete isolation for so long, were now part of a larger, more deadly game of warfare. They were no longer just wives, but targets in the ongoing conflict. And yet, in the silence of their homes and the hidden corners of their world, the wives of Taliban leaders would continue to live, suffer, and survive until the day they were erased completely. But for some, the end would come in a different way, not at the hands of a drone, but in the hands of their own husbands, or through the brutal enforcement of the system they were forced to uphold. By 2016, one name had become synonymous with terror in Pakistan and Afghanistan: Mullah Fazlullah. Known as the leader of the Pakistani Taliban and infamous for his brutal enforcement of extremist rule in the Swat Valley, Fazlullah's influence had spread far beyond the region. His reign of terror involved public executions, the banning of girls' education, and the destruction of anything seen as contrary to his twisted interpretation of Islam. He was also responsible for the brutal attack on Malala Yousafzai, the young Pakistani activist who was shot for advocating girls' education. Fazlullah became one of the most wanted men in the region, both for his violence and his ability to evade capture. The Pakistani military launched multiple operations to eliminate him, but he remained elusive, hiding deep in the tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan. The U.S. military, along with Pakistani intelligence, pursued him relentlessly, using drones and special forces to target his compounds. Throughout this period, reports surfaced about his wife. She was thought to have been killed in one of the numerous airstrikes aimed at Fazlullah's hideouts. In 2016, Pakistani newspapers reported her death, stating that she had been among the casualties in a drone attack. For many, it seemed like another casualty of war. Women associated with the Taliban were often treated as invisible, their fates sealed by association with their husbands. But the reports about her death were premature. A year later, in August 2017, an astonishing revelation surfaced. Her name appeared in an unexpected place, a Taliban-affiliated women's magazine called Sunat-e-Kaula. The publication, which had been created to appeal to women within the Taliban network, included an interview with none other than Mullah Fazlullah's wife. In the interview, she spoke about her life, her struggles, and her experience as the wife of one of the most dangerous men in the world. Her story was not just about survival. It was a narrative of complicity, loyalty, and the brutal reality of life within the Taliban's inner circle. She described how, even in the face of constant danger, she had continued to live in hiding, moving from one location to another as the world around her fell apart. She spoke about the terror of knowing her husband was targeted for assassination by the U.S. and Pakistani forces, and how she and her children lived with the constant fear of death hanging over them. Her reappearance in the magazine shocked many. Not only was she alive, but her interview revealed the extent to which the wives of Taliban leaders were complicit in the war effort, shaping the narrative of extremism from behind the scenes. While the world had focused on Fazlullah's crimes, this woman's survival suggested that even in exile, the Taliban's influence remained powerful. The interview also revealed that she was still actively involved in Taliban activities, using her position to support the movement's cause. While many believed she had been lost to history, she had not only survived, but continued to play a role in the very network that had once enslaved her.
This story raised a haunting question. How many other wives of Taliban leaders had survived and continued their roles in this brutal movement, even after their husbands were gone? The world had never fully understood the power dynamics within these households. While the men fought in the shadows of mountains, their wives often remained hidden, quietly holding on to their husbands' ideologies and continuing their legacy. Fazlullah's wife's story was a stark reminder that the war against the Taliban was not just fought on the battlefield, it was also fought in the homes of the very people who created this global threat. These women, though hidden and silenced, remained part of the ongoing war, shaping the future of extremism in ways few ever expected. In August 2021, after nearly 20 years of war, the world watched in disbelief as the Taliban swept back into power. The Afghan government, supported by international forces, crumbled overnight. Kabul fell, and the country was once again under the control of the very group that had enforced the brutal oppression of women in the 1990s. But this time, the Taliban's return was even more alarming. The fears that many Afghan families had long anticipated became a reality. With the U.S. withdrawal complete, the Taliban had reclaimed their hold on the country with overwhelming speed. For the women of Afghanistan, this meant the return of a life they had feared would never end, a life of restriction, surveillance, and violence. In the days following their return, there were reports from provinces such as Takhar, Kunduz, and Ghor, where Taliban commanders were already compiling lists of unmarried women aged 15 to 45. These lists were handed over to village elders with direct orders that daughters must be handed over to Taliban fighters as wives. For the women of Afghanistan, this wasn't just about losing their freedom, it was about losing their very sense of self, becoming bargaining chips in the Taliban's campaign to solidify control over the population.
Families who refused to comply faced violence, imprisonment, and threats. In some cases, beatings or arbitrary arrests were used to enforce compliance, forcing families to make a terrible decision: hand over their daughters to Taliban soldiers or risk death or punishment. In rural areas where the Taliban had established absolute power, these forced marriages were presented as a way of securing loyalty or rewarding soldiers for their service. The notion of rewarding soldiers by giving them women for marriage wasn't new. In fact, this practice was reminiscent of the Taliban's earlier rule in the 1990s, when they used women's bodies as both spoils of war and tools of control. One of the most disturbing and well-documented cases emerged just months after the Taliban's return. A young woman named Ilaha, a 25-year-old medical student from Kabul, became a target. Ilaha was no ordinary citizen. She was the daughter of General Abdul Rahman Rahmani, a high-ranking officer in the Afghan Air Force who had worked closely with U.S. military officials. Her connection to the former Afghan government made her a prime target for the Taliban, who sought to humiliate and punish those linked to the fallen regime. In January 2022, Ilaha was abducted from her home by Taliban intelligence agents. Her abduction was not a random act, but a targeted move to degrade her family, further asserting the Taliban's dominance over those who had opposed them. Ilaha was forced into a marriage with Qari Saeed Kosti, a senior Taliban commander who had once served as a spokesman for the Taliban's interior ministry. She was stripped of her rights, cut off from her family, and forced to live under the control of a man who embodied everything her family had fought against. Ilaha's story was not one of passive submission. In August 2022, she managed to record a series of videos from within the confines of her captor's home. In these videos, she showed the bruises on her face, the scars on her body, and the mental toll that her forced marriage had taken on her. The videos, which Ilaha managed to share with activists, became an incredible act of defiance. For many women in Afghanistan, it was the first time they had seen someone within the Taliban system speak out so openly about the abuse they were enduring. Her courage sparked widespread outrage both inside Afghanistan and internationally. The videos spread quickly on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp, where they were seen by those who had no idea of the brutality being carried out behind closed doors. Within hours, her name became synonymous with resistance and the harsh reality that women in Afghanistan continued to face under the Taliban's reign. But as her story gained attention, so did the Taliban's wrath. In September 2022, Ilaha was tracked down by Taliban intelligence agents. Her family desperately searched for her, contacting officials in the hopes of locating her, but the Taliban denied holding her. It was only later that it became clear Ilaha had vanished into one of the Taliban's most secretive detention centers in Kabul. These facilities were not like normal prisons. They were run by Taliban intelligence, with no oversight, no legal rights, and no access to families or lawyers. Ilaha's fate had become a symbol of the ongoing war against women in Afghanistan. As her family searched for her, the Taliban continued to enforce its brutal rule, turning women into pawns in their larger fight for control. For months, Ilaha's family had no idea where she was. Despite their desperate search, the Taliban refused to acknowledge they were holding her. In their eyes, Ilaha had become a disappeared person, another victim of their brutal system, erased from the world's sight, trapped in one of the most secretive arms of the Taliban rule. Her family was left in the dark, not knowing if she was alive or dead, if she would ever see the light of day again. For Ilaha, the nightmare was only just beginning. When she was taken to the Taliban's detention center, the abuse she endured was unimaginable. These weren't typical prisons. The Taliban-run intelligence centers were designed to break prisoners, to erase any sense of hope or dignity. Inside these dark, cold, and isolated facilities, women like Ilaha were subjected to constant physical and psychological torture. She was beaten regularly, sometimes with sticks, sometimes with rifle butts. Sometimes the guards would deny her food and water for days, hoping to break her spirit. The torture wasn't just physical, it was designed to break her mind as well. Interrogators tied her to chairs, shocking her with electric wires, demanding that she confess to being part of a plot against the Taliban. They accused her of being a foreign agent, a traitor to the regime, simply because she had dared to speak out. Her body withered, she lost weight rapidly, and her once strong spirit began to crumble under the constant abuse. But even in the depths of despair, she refused to give in. She held on to a small, fragile sliver of hope, the belief that somehow she would survive. For months, her world was a blur of pain, hunger, and humiliation. But as time passed, something extraordinary happened. Ilaha's will to survive became stronger than the forces trying to break her. In April 2023, after 156 days in captivity, Ilaha managed to escape. The details of her escape remain a secret, as revealing them could endanger others who helped her. What is known is that it required incredible courage and resourcefulness. The Taliban's detention centers were heavily guarded, and anyone caught helping a prisoner escape risked execution. But somehow, Ilaha managed to break free from the grip of the Taliban's iron fist. Her escape was nothing short of a miracle. Against all odds, she emerged from the darkness, battered but alive. When she was finally able to speak, she shared her story with the world. Her survival became a symbol of the strength and resilience of the women who had been oppressed under Taliban rule, women whose stories had often been silenced or ignored. Her escape was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time, the world saw the brutal realities faced by women who dared to defy the Taliban, and it sparked an international outcry. Her story became a rallying cry for those who had suffered in silence for too long. But even in freedom, Ilaha's battle was far from over. She had survived the most brutal form of captivity, but her escape did not erase the trauma she had endured. The scars, both physical and psychological, would stay with her forever. For Ilaha and for countless other women in Afghanistan, survival meant more than just escaping a detention center. It meant navigating a world where their freedom was always at risk, where their voices were still stifled by the weight of their past.
Her story was not just about survival, it was about the ongoing fight for justice and freedom for all women in Afghanistan. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when the world has seemed to forget them, the strength of women like Ilaha will always shine through, no matter the cost. The future remains uncertain, but Ilaha's survival offers a glimmer of hope for the millions of women still trapped under the Taliban's rule. Her story, though brutal, is one of defiance, and for that, it must never be forgotten.